Cornwall Historical Society, Board of Directors. Welcome. I'm Barbara Gold, President of the Board, and we're delighted to see loyal friends and new faces in the audience. For the benefit of the latter, some details. Some of you snuck in before I got here with the guest book. Please sign it because one of our sponsors, Connecticut Humanities, likes an accounting at the end of the season of how many people have attended our various events. So it's kind of important. We're not going to make you pay any dues, but we would like you to sign the book. Also, if you would like to receive email notices of our events, there is also a page there for you to sign up your email address. And finally, in advance, let me thank Matthew's 1812 House for the cookies you'll enjoy after the talk. Deanna and Blaine Matthews have been very generous in stimulating our taste buds for the past several years, and we do appreciate that. Now it's time for a heads up. Some of you may remember that Rachel Guest, our curator, commented in her curator's talk last month that this was the hardest exhibit she had ever worked on. Not because discovering the material was challenging, but because the material itself was so challenging. She had to read one heartbreaking story after another. Those of you who have seen the exhibit understand what she was talking about. Our talk today examines perhaps the most heartbreaking battle story of the war, the Battle of Cold Harbor. It is said that this is the one battle that Grant regretted. After 13 days of battle, much of it trench warfare, 13,000 Union troops and nearly 5,000 Confederate troops were either killed, wounded, missing, or captured. This is not necessarily the kind of story one might choose to linger on a lovely August afternoon in the Northwest Hills of Connecticut. But it is a part of our history and our heritage, and perhaps we can learn something from hearing it. No one is better qualified to recount this chapter of our history than our speaker today. After a successful career in banking, which I won't go into because we're not interested in that, Waite Rawls has been for a decade executive director of the Museum of the Confederacy in Richmond, Virginia, and more recently also the co-CEO of the American Civil War Museum. To call Waite a Civil War buff seems to understate the case. He and his wife, Malou, have owned a home in Cornwall since 1984, and we are most grateful that he is willing to take time from his vacation for a bit of a busman's holiday to share his knowledge and his wisdom with us today. Waite?
Thank you so much, Barbara. And you can uncover the thing. I can't tell you how much it pleases me to be here today with all of you. It is a busman's holiday, but as my wife Malou knows, every day is a busman's holiday for me because I can't stop talking about the Civil War. Her expression is MIGO, which stands for my eyes glaze over. But to set the stage a little bit, can that get focused just a touch?
To get out of focus, I think a little bit.
Out of focus.
Here comes our technician.
Hot diggity dog. That's good. May 16th, 1864. 24-year-old Edward Wadham from Goshen was killed in battle at Drury's Bluff, about 10 miles below Richmond. He was fighting with the 8th Connecticut Infantry. 10 days later, 33-year-old Henry Wadham, his oldest brother, was killed in action fighting at North Anna, about 20 miles north of Richmond, with the 14th Connecticut. On June the 1st, 30-year-old Luman Wadham was killed in action at Cold Harbor, fighting with the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery. 15 days, 3 different units, 3 different battles, and 3 brothers in one grieving mother. The Civil War is amazing. 750,000 soldiers died during the Civil War. That's more than all other American wars combined. If we were to norm that for the population today, it would be about 8 million people. All of us lived through 9/11, and we grieve the people who died on 9/11. That many people died, or an equivalent number, died during the Civil War every 12 hours for 4 years. The Civil War defined us today. I like to tell people that if you had said the Pledge of Allegiance before the Civil War, you would have said, "One nation divisible, with liberty and justice for a few white men." But I'm here today to talk about just a couple of hours during that war and one group of men. I'd like to congratulate, before I start, I'd like to congratulate Rachel Guest for her fabulous exhibit that the Historical Society did. I told Rachel that so many people, even in my home state of Virginia, where 60% of all the battles were fought, so many people said there's nothing for us to commemorate here because there's no battle here. And my response was, but your people were from here, despite the fact that they were fighting there, for you to commemorate the people. And she just did a fabulous job of that with tremendous research on the part of a lot of people, but most particularly Rachel. And she brought their story of 150 years ago to us. And as I'm sure that a lot of you, as I did, you go through the exhibit and the surnames are real familiar. I mean, there's a lot of golds in that room, Barbara. I'd like to also thank Barbara for arranging this talk today. We've talked about it for a long time, and it's a long time coming, and I'm just tickled to be here. And I'd like to also thank my Popple Swamp Road PR firm of Connie Sturwalt and Deborah Tyler for pushing me to do this talk. And also Debbie Jones. Aren't they wonderful flowers in the back? You've got the best garden in the world, Debbie. But let's get on with the Battle of Cold Harbor, and actually the first day of the Battle of Cold Harbor. We know about the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery, but what happened to them? How did it happen, and why did it happen? I love to try to put things in context a bit. So let's start with a little background. In the spring of 1862, Abraham Lincoln had called for 300,000 volunteers to fight what looked like it was going to be a long war. The people at the beginning of it said, maybe 1 or 2 big battles and it'll be over with. And Lincoln realized that and called for 300,000 volunteers. Now, one of the volunteer groups was here in Litchfield County. 1,000 men from Litchfield County signed up to join the 19th Connecticut Infantry. And they were assigned to defend Washington City. That's what they called it then, Washington City. This was a Litchfield County crowd. If you look at the list of where the companies came from, and back then, you didn't join the army and they assigned you to a company. You joined a company from your local town. So there was a company naturally from Cornwall, but a couple companies from Litchfield, Salisbury, Goshen, Plymouth, Winsted, New Hartford, New Milford, Woodbury. And you can imagine these men all coming together in Litchfield, and they knew each other. Even if you were from a different company in a different town, you knew each other because you might have a cousin who lived next door or gone to school with or married a cousin. They were reorganized as the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery. Now, what is heavy artillery? It's not just cannons, but big cannons. The problem with big cannons is they're hard to move. So you tend to be stationary if you're with big cannons, and their stationary position was in the defenses of Washington. There wasn't much to do in the defenses of Washington. The Confederates got close once, but you sat around and bided your time. So what else did you do? Well, every time there was a parade, you marched in the parade. You were the bandbox soldiers. You had the nice uniforms. You ate well. You slept inside. You had a bed rather than sleeping on rocks and ground. Until on May the 17th, 1864, they were called up as infantry, not as artillery. And they were, by that time, 1,800 strong. And your typical regiment at that time in the Northern Army could have been 500 or 600 men. In a Confederate Army could have been 300 men. So you could imagine this was an enormous group of men who were called up on May the 17th. So what happened? First, we're at towards the end of the Overland Campaign. U.S. Grant had become the commander of the all Union forces, and his strategy was very simple. We will fight everywhere at the same time. Therefore, the Confederates couldn't move troops around. So he started Sherman, headed for Atlanta from Chattanooga, Tennessee. And he started Nathaniel Banks into Texas along the Red River. He started Franz Sigel up the Valley of Virginia. Now, up the valley means going south. And he started Ben Butler from Fort Monroe at the tip of across the James River from Norfolk towards Richmond. And Grant stayed with the biggest army, the Army of the Potomac, and they headed from Washington south. Starting right at the 1st of May, there was a month of almost continual combat, particularly with the Army of the Potomac. I mean, always before, you'd have a battle, then everybody pulled back, and you'd rest and refit, and the sick men would get well, and the wounded men would get well and come back into the ranks, and then you'd go fight again. But this time it was almost every day fighting. Grant's movements had led the Army of the Potomac very close to Richmond. Cold Harbor is 10 miles from my house, which is inside the city limits of Richmond. The battle could be heard at my house, that close to Richmond. For 4 years, for 3 years, the slogan of the North had been on to Richmond. Everything was on to Richmond, and they were almost there. The 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery arrived at the front lines on the 30th of May. They called up on the 17th, and they arrived on the 30th of May, 2 weeks later. 2 days later, Grant ordered a frontal assault on all the Confederate lines of the men he had in place at that time against the Confederates that they had in place. The Confederate forces had only arrived about 36 hours before. By this time in the war, both sides had perfected the art of digging in and entrenching. Early in the war, it was thought to be unmanly to dig trenches. The manly, courageous thing to do was to stand in long lines with flags waving and bands playing and charge across open fields to demonstrate your courage, not only to your comrades from your hometown, but also to the opposing forces. By this time in the war, however, both sides said, that's crazy. Dig a hole and get in the hole. I like to say that before, what you would do is you would march, you'd stop, you'd pick a campsite, you'd make a fire, you'd brew some coffee, maybe cook dinner, put up your tent, fix a bed, and then maybe you would dig in. And now both armies, as soon as they stopped, they started digging. They didn't wait for the wagon with the picks and shovels. They started digging with bayonets and plates and cups and anything else they had. They started digging. And the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery was right in the middle of the Union attack on this Confederate entrenched position. Now, this is a picture of what those trench lines look like today. Now, these pictures don't do justice to what was actually there. I want to talk a bit about trenches so that you understand what was going on here. Civil War trenches, the first thing you did was the generals would create a line and say, this is where we're going to dig in. You'd go out in front and chop down all the trees. And that was to clear your field of fire so you could see everything. You know, the Battle of Cold Harbor back then was in a wooded area. So you cut down all the trees. Now you take the logs and you build a log wall along that line that's going to be the trenches. Then you take all the branches and you sharpen the ends of them and point them outside. Now, it's almost as bad as trying to maneuver your way through multiflora roses in a field here in Litchfield County. But all those tree branches sharpened, pointed towards the enemy, worked like barbed wire. You had to kind of pick your way through it. You couldn't just advance in a line through it. So then what you would do is you would dig a trench right behind your log wall. And you take the dirt that you dug and throw it over the log wall so that eventually you had a dirt mound in front of the logs in a trench that you could stand in, and you wanted it about this deep so that you could look over the top and point your musket and shoot at the other guys. You shoot at them while they're picking their way through the branches, and they can't shoot at you because you're in the trench. And this is what the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery was fighting. Okay, I've got some pictures here, excuse me, out there on the battlefield that the Park Service has put up. This is a sign that's right at the where the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery formed in its line to make its attack. And you can see the headline is "A Bloody Baptism of Fire." And I wish it was a little clearer. I even tried to do a close-up of it, and you still can't read it. But if you look, that's the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery charging right in the middle. And you can see a little line, and I'll tell you what that line is in a second. But this was June the 1st of 1864. Now, in this picture, almost invisible at the bottom is a little bitty stream. That little bitty stream was real important that day. And I'll tell you why in a second. Halfway up, the Park Service has a little path through the woods. And I was going to take a bunch of pictures of the whole battlefield, but it's all woods and trees today. You really can't see much, with the exception of there along the Confederate trench lines. There's a little pathway that says "Hot Work" at Cold Harbor, and it's right on the path, right alongside that creek, because the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery advanced right along that creek, half the men on either side of the creek. And they ran into a hail of bullets. Okay, but they said, "We have broken through." This was very important. The first thing that they hit as they advanced was Confederate pickets. And what are pickets? Pickets are a small number of men that you put out in front of your lines, and they dig what we call today a foxhole. They call it a rifle pit back then, but you dig a little hole and you get in it. And you're supposed to be the first alert, because if anybody advances against you, you'll see them or hear them first. You'll start shooting, and then you turn around and haul, you know what, back to your lines. And the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery captured quite a few of the Confederate pickets. And so they were emboldened. You're talking about a group of men who spent 2 years doing nothing in Washington, except for playing bandbox soldier and marching in parades. You're talking about a group of men who have joined veteran forces, and the veteran forces are deriding them, saying, you know, you're nothing. You haven't seen the hardship. And so you've got something to prove to all these men. And you capture those pickets and you're saying, look what we're doing. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. Well, the trick to it was that little stream had developed into a little swamp right at the Confederate lines. And the Confederates had not entrenched right where that little stream came through. And the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery poured through that hole in the Confederate lines. Okay. Now, before the fight was over, 323 men in the unit were casualties. This set an all-time record for the most casualties in any regiment during the entire Civil War. Most casualties of any Union regiment during the entire Civil War. That was by counting the men, not the percentage, but by counting the men. And this is not exactly a record that you want to set. It's not the highest percentage of the Union regiments. The 1st Minnesota at Gettysburg had 82% casualties. In the second day, as the Confederates were advancing, Winfield Scott Hancock saw the Confederates advancing, had no troops on hand except for the 1st Minnesota, and said, see those 10,000 men? Charge them. And they looked around and said, there's 300 of us, 10,000 of them. Yes, sir. And they charged and they stopped the Confederates for about 15 minutes, which bought time to save the Union line at Gettysburg. Also at Gettysburg, the 26th North Carolina had 91% casualties. They fought on the first day and again on the third day. They had 20 color bearers shot down in those two things. So 323 is a lot, don't get me wrong, but it's not the most devastating thing. Okay, this is a marker on the battlefield that was only put up several years ago. And it is to the 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery and their sacrifice that day. Here's a close-up of it. And if you look just above the middle, Company G was the Cornwall Company. So it's got listed there the 3 men from Cornwall who were killed in the battle that day. Sergeant Joseph Payne, Private Timothy Leonard, and Private Monroe Sickman. Now, how did it happen? We've talked about what happened, but how did it happen? First of all, these guys had no training as infantry. This was the 1st of June. They were called up on the 17th of May. They had 2 weeks to train as infantry. And oh, by the way, you got to get from Washington all the way down here to Richmond in the same 2 weeks. So they had almost no drill. A bunch of the men simply did not know how to load and fire a gun. They knew how to load and fire a cannon, but it's a whole lot different than a musket. They had no combat experience. Now, the veterans knew that if you come under heavy fire, the first thing you do is you go to the ground. You lie down to avoid the fire. These guys are trying to prove their courage, so they were going to stand up, stand tall, put the flag up. Exactly the wrong thing to do in a battle like this. Now, again, a veteran unit knew that you always stayed in a line with the people to the left of you and the people to the right of you, because you didn't want to expose your flanks. The 2nd Connecticut Heavy Artillery advanced, hit that little hole, advanced right into the hole, And they still had Confederates in front of them. They now had Confederates on the left of them, and they had Confederates on the right of them. The other men had stopped because they hit the Confederate trenches. So they had walked right into what became a killing field. Colonel E.S. Kellogg from Litchfield was their regimental commander. Very courageous man. He gave his life that day, proving his courage. But a very courageous man, leading men who had something to prove. Okay, now, like I said, they had advanced right along that creek bed. There were no Confederate trenches directly in front of them. They got psyched. They captured the Confederate pickets. Look what we're doing. We're succeeding. We're driving them. And they continued to advance. Now, why did it happen? And this tries to get this battle, this instance, this regiment into some context. Grant had taken enormous casualties in the previous couple of weeks. This was when Grant picked up his nickname, the Butcher. Now, but his attitude was, we can capture all the territory we want to, but we have to defeat those armies. The way we will win is to defeat the Confederate armies. So where Robert E. Lee goes, I will go to Sherman. Where Joe Johnston goes, you go. So it was assault, 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 combat, combat. I've got more men than he does. Just keep at it. And in a little less than a month, he lost 44,000 men. In 6 weeks, it was close to 60,000. The casualties that Barbara mentioned at the beginning of this at Cold Harbor of 13,000 Union casualties are not in that total. That was more men than Robert E. Lee had at the beginning of the campaign. Okay, again, why did it happen? Grant desperately needed replacements for a lot of reasons. One of them was 44,000 men that he started with were no longer with him. But a big factor was, when is this? This is the end of May. 3 years earlier was May of 1861. When did most Union troops volunteer? May of 1861. For how long did they volunteer? For 3 years. So during this same period of butchery, my enlistment's up. Now, I have my choice. I can either re-up, as they say in the Army today. I can volunteer for an extended service, or I can go home. And a lot of men simply went home. They said, look, I've seen enough of this. Grant's crazy. I'm going to die. I've done my part. And far more, and I give Rachel great credit in the exhibit here, a tremendous number of Northerners did not like Lincoln. They disagreed with Lincoln. They said, I'm fighting Lincoln's war. It's the wrong war. I'm out of here. I thought I was fighting. So this is twice as much as what happened to the Confederates in Pickett's charge, which is far more famous, Pickett's charge. This is Grant's official report. This assault cost us heavily and probably without benefit to compensate. And then in his memoirs with full reflection, he said, quote, I have always regretted that the last assault at Cold Harbor was ever made. So that concludes my prepared remarks. I'm willing to take questions for as long as you're willing to stay. Let me just give one quick pitch for the American Civil War Museum. It is the biggest and best Civil War museum in the nation. The Museum of the Confederacy was part of a combination with another museum. We include the White House of the Confederacy fully restored to what it was like when Jefferson Davis and his family lived there. And we've got all of Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, Jeb Stuart, Stonewall Jackson, you name your famous Confederate, and his stuff is there. But over half of the collection is civilian, not just military. So if you're in Richmond, come see us. And even if you live in Cornwall, because I do have one Goshen member up here in the front, you can always join us. Thanks very much. Jeff, you get the first question.
Did the Union newspapers report what happened accurately, or was there a tendency to whitewash things?
We complain about newspapers today. Newspapers today have the highest possible standard of ethics compared to newspapers back then. First of all, what news did they have? Lincoln needed a victory. He didn't need a massive defeat. One of the signs of who won a battle was the loser would put up white flags and say, okay, we need to go out into no man's land and collect the wounded. Grant refused to do that for 2 days, and several thousand of those men were wounded and they died in the June heat, waiting for Grant to admit that he had been beaten. So his reports back to Washington were not nearly what we now know happened. Why? Because that's not what Lincoln wanted to hear. Okay. The northern newspapers were unbelievable. Neutral, moderate, didn't exist. You were either a Democratic paper or a Republican paper. Republican papers reported Grant nearing Richmond, Grant in a standoff battle with Lee. The Democratic newspapers were reporting horrible defeat by Union forces, blame it on Abe Lincoln. So reading the newspaper reports of most of these battles was very interesting. Reading the newspapers reports of Gettysburg, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address was unbelievable. You know, what you and I now think is perhaps the finest speech in American history. The only thing I know that contends with it is Washington's farewell address. The Democratic papers up north just lambasted Lincoln for the Gettysburg Address. So what the papers would report and what actually happened was often two different things, and that's what happened here. Questions?
Is there a book that describes more or less what you presented?
Barbara and I were talking earlier. Since the end of the Civil War, 80,000 books have been written. That's 1.5 books every day since Appomattox. They're now coming out a little more than 3 per day. There's not one book about this battle. There's multiples. Okay, perhaps the best one is by, and I wish I could remember the name of it, but it's by a man named Gordon Ray, R-H-E-A. He's an attorney down in Charleston, and he's written a series of books about each one of these battles of the Overland Campaign, and it's pretty good. And it was interesting. I was out on the Cold Harbor battlefield with Gordon, and he was the one who I couldn't understand how that many guys could die or be casualties in that short period of time. And he says, wait, look at your topography. You've got a series of hills pointing towards the Union lines with little ravines in these creek beds. And as the normal Confederate defense would have been a straight line that went up and down the hills, but instead they did their lines defending the high ground. So if you advanced and hit one of the hills, you stopped. And if you hit one of the ravines, you continued to advance into that killing field. And it was the best explanation I had ever gotten of exactly what happened there, particularly to the 2nd Connecticut Heavies. Yes, sir.
There's also another good book, June 19th.
Yes. Very good book. Very good book.
As someone who is constantly presenting material about the Civil War, with its still very divisive approach, both different sections of the country, different political attitudes, how do you think about the problems of presenting this material in a way that is fair, honest, objective, but also responds to the needs of different audiences and so on?
It's a very good question. One of the things that we pledge to ourselves at the museum is we need to be historically correct, if not politically correct. And as you say, even today, you have to rate the rater. You have to try to decipher, does this person have an agenda when they're talking? And historians in the past 20 years have developed more agendas than in 100 years. There was distinct agendas in the memoirs. I used to read the memoirs and say, boy, this is good history. And then all of a sudden, it dawned on me that maybe Bill Clinton's memoir was not good history. So therefore, I should discount what other memoirs were like, because it was a spin. I have particular difficulty with what one great historian called the North's treasury of virtue. It was all about slavery. We were right, they were wrong. Everybody was united behind Lincoln. We won. Get over it. And it's not that easy. When you read the letters of the soldiers, then it's like reading the letters of the soldiers today. I'm not sure how many soldiers who are in Afghanistan or something are sitting there saying, well, you know, the geopolitical agenda of the United States these days is such and such, and therefore I'm going to be brave or not. I'm here with my buddies. I'm here because I'd be hooted, back then. I'm here in the lines because the amount of grief I'd catch if I'd stayed home is not worth it, or because my girlfriend thinks I'll look cool in my uniform, or my brother is here, and not a political agenda. And so we try to get people to think about the common person who got wrapped up in this. Again, the unified North and unified South was true in 1865, and it was anything but true in 1860. You know, the Civil War actually united the two sections against each other, rather than representing a already separate. I'm a Virginian, and I still think like a Virginian. Virginians are obnoxious. And the Virginians are particularly, we suffer with the Civil War, we suffer from a peculiar disease known as VD. It stands for Virginia disease. It's because we think it all happened in Virginia. Well, you know, a lot of it did happen in Virginia, but little towns like Cornwall, Connecticut were also affected. Virginia voted to stay in the Union by a margin of 2-1 a month after Lincoln's inauguration, and sent a delegation led by former President John Tyler to meet with Lincoln. And Lincoln refused to meet with them because he was trying to solidify the base in his brand new political party. The Republican Party then was about as old as our Tea Party is today. I have yet to find an example in history where a politician moving to solidify his base is rewarded by history as the right thing to do. It's almost always the wrong thing to do, and in Lincoln's case at the beginning of the war, it was the wrong thing to do. The Virginia delegation told Lincoln, let those crazy people in the Deep South go. Somehow or another, we can reconstruct the Union without them, and 10 or 20 years from now, they'll figure out that they need to join us again, and they'll come back in. So don't precipitate anything at Fort Sumter, specifically Fort Sumter, or you will lose Virginia in 48 hours, and that was the quote. Well, Lincoln did precipitate something at Fort Sumter to satisfy the far right, or far left, I don't know which direction it was, of his party. The war was started. Virginia, it didn't take them 48 hours, it took them 72. And the vote switched 2-1 to secede because they said, this is not the Union that we believe in. This is not the Union that George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, James Monroe, and all those Virginia dudes created. So, but, you know, people say I'm hard on Abraham Lincoln. I am hard. His first 100 days was the worst in the history of our nation. His last 100 days were the best in the history of our nation. So, you know, you try to get people to think beyond their normal, what they thought, or what the public narrative or the street story is. And you try to get them to think about the complexity of it. I grew up 5 miles from the home places of 2 famous generals. One was Billy Mahone, famous Confederate general, particularly late in the war. He stood all of 5 feet tall and weighed 95 pounds. He was wounded, and his wife heard the report that it's nothing but a flesh wound, and she said, but Billy has no flesh. And right down the road from him is the home place of George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, behind Grant and Sherman, probably the 3rd best general in the Union armies. And you see the division of the country because of the complexity back then. Again, a little anecdote. Stonewall Jackson's Valley campaign, he's got his army and they're going north through the Valley of Virginia to Front Royal. And he sends scouts ahead and says, is anybody there to defend it? Yes, 1 regiment. Which regiment? Well, it's the 1st Maryland, U.S. And Jackson goes, I got a 1st Maryland. So the 1st Confederate Maryland advanced to fight the 1st U.S. Maryland. And they fought it out. The 1st Confederate Maryland was carrying a distinctive flag that's in our collection that was also carried by the Maryland line in the War of 1812 and the Maryland line in the Revolutionary War. So here, this is brother against brother. You can't get more brother against brother. If things were that clear as they are in hindsight today, I'm not sure they were that clear back then. So the biggest thing is to get people to think beyond their normal scope and just try to stick with the truth as you can best interpret it. Good question. I recommend Lee's lieutenants all the time. I'd say I got to get a question from somebody from Richmond. But Douglas Southall Freeman, Pulitzer Prize winner, did a 3-volume set on Lee's lieutenants. Do you know what Douglas Southall Freeman's first job was? He was a good friend of her father's. Fabulous, one of the top Civil War historians. His first job when he graduated from Johns Hopkins, he was brought to the Museum of the Confederacy, and he sat there for a year, and the ladies, our institution was run by ladies for 100 years. The ladies brought him an item at a time, and he created our first catalog of artifacts. It was his first job. Question back. Yes, ma'am.
Not as deep. Who actually put up the memorial to the Connecticut boys?
You got an answer right behind you.
I, I'm, two of us, board members
Yeah, he testified. See, with practice, and I have practice, you can recognize reenactors. Turn around and look behind you and check out the facial hair. Okay. Yes, sir.
Very small question, but where is the flag that the Marylanders carried during the Revolution and then in the War of 1812?
It's in the
Annapolis, or?
no, it's in the sub-basement of our vault. Yeah, it's one of there are 1,300 Confederate flags that are known to exist, and 550 of them are in our vault. And the flags tell stories that are unbelievable. First of all, you know, what most of you would think of as the Confederate flag, the rectangular thing with an X on it.
No, I'm thinking of the Regiment of Horsemen. I'm not thinking of the American flag. We didn't have one.
No, they're all American flags.
In Portland, there's no American flag. But, I mean, the gorget of the regiment that fought, you said the first Maryland
Yeah,
flag
correct.
carried during the Revolution, the War of 1812,
Correct.
and then again during the Civil War.
It's not 3x5, and it's white silk with a seal of the state of Maryland on it, and it's in our vault
Why isn't it in Annapolis?
because it belongs to us. It was donated to us by its color bearer. Now, in all seriousness, we lend things to places quite seriously all across the country. The flag of the CSS Shenandoah is now down in Australia, where the Shenandoah visited. But let me go back to the flags for a second. The Confederate First National Flag is a rectangular thing with a red bar, a white bar, a red bar, a blue canton, and a circle of stars. Looks like a Revolutionary War flag. And they carried that flag, or some units carried that flag in First Manassas. And the wind wasn't blowing. So that American flag looked a lot like the other American flag called the Stars and Stripes. And the wrong guys started shooting at the wrong guys. So the Confederate generals came back after the battle and said, we need a different flag to use in battle. Not a different national flag, but a different battle flag. And it referred it to a congressional committee, which came up with a design, a blue rectangular flag with an upright red St. George's cross with white stars on it. And they proposed that. It immediately ran into objections. Anybody want to guess why? It's too doggone Christian. Okay, now here's a great fact. Jewish people were far more dominant, prevalent in the South in 1860 than in the North. You know, we think of New York City having a large Jewish population. That's Ellis Island stuff, man. That's 1880s and 90s. In the big southern port cities, there were very prominent Jewish populations, and they said, that thing is too Christian for us. And a synagogue in Charleston suggested instead that you put a saltire on the flag. A saltire is the word from heraldry of an X on a flag. And so that the committee took the advice of that synagogue from Charleston and designed the Confederate battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia, which is a square thing. Now, the rectangular thing that you see on the bumper stickers and the baseball hats was almost never used in the Civil War. If you had shown it to most Confederate veterans, they would have said, wow, never seen one like that. Where did it come from? The second most popular battle flag in the Confederate armies, carried by hundreds of thousands of men, was a big blue rectangle with a white polka dot in the middle of it. Man, you could put that one on a bumper sticker, nobody would know what the heck it was. So the Confederate flag that people know today is the Confederate flag of the 1960s not the 1860s. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious to know whether there are any African Americans involved either with the Museum of the Confederacy or you say now are involved in the American Civil War?
Yeah. My co-CEO is African American. She's semi-famous. She was the one who began the slave living history program at Colonial Williamsburg that was so, notorious when it first came out. We've got 4 African Americans on the board, including the director of the Civil Rights Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina, where the Woolworth was. We were talking earlier, his favorite guide of the White House is a black Muslim named Abdur. And people show up at the White House of the Confederacy and they kind of, this is not what I expected. And he's terrific. So yeah, there were 30 million people living in America at the time of the Civil War. 4 million of them were of some African descent. About 1/10 of them in the South were free. You tend to think of, all blacks were slaves. Well, that's not true. Had quite a few blacks who were slave owners, not just slaves. I think one of the fascinating things is how were people of mixed race treated at the time. And there were a lot of people of mixed race back then. If you were of mixed race and a slave, you were treated as a slave. And I can show you pictures of the cutest little blonde-haired, blue-eyed slaves that you've ever seen. But if you were free and you had an education of mixed race, you were treated as white by law in most states. By law, in 1860, Barack Obama was a white man. So again, this is not what we thought. This is not the story that they neglected to tell us in school. And we do get a lot of, I had a father and son last week from California. The father brought the son to Virginia because the son's 10th grade teacher decided that rather than teaching the American Civil War, she thought that students would be more interested in India. And he said, the American Civil War is a bit more important. We're going to go learn it on our own. So we do that. Yes, sir.
Can you talk a little bit more about your museum and why I want to drive from Connecticut?
Yeah. We have talked about the museum and why anyone would want to drive from Connecticut to get there. Yeah, well, why, from my memory in the front from Goshen, why wouldn't you, is the question. If you're interested at all in the Civil War, you will see more of the real stuff at our museum than anywhere. Again, the predominance of the artifacts are Confederate. Because it was established in 1890 to be something of the Smithsonian of the Confederacy. It was your duty to donate your stuff. Everything was donated to us. Over half of our collection was in place before 1905, usually donated by the men or women who had lived through it. There's no northern counterpart to that. A couple of states have good state collections. Pennsylvania's got a good state collection. But, if your hero was from Ohio, you're not going to find it in a Pennsylvania museum. So the northern stuff is far more scattered, and it's concentrated, in our case, at our museum. The White House of the Confederacy itself is something. When the National Historic Landmark Program was started, there were only 50 named in the country, 3 in Virginia, Mount Vernon, Monticello, and the White House of the Confederacy. So that's the league we play in. And unlike most of those, all of our furnishings most all of the furnishings are the original furnishings. And Verena Davis was one of our founders, and she told us how the house was decorated. So when you go in, you don't hear, here's a sideboard of the period like that when Thomas Jefferson lived here. You say, that sideboard was between those two windows and that silver compote sat on it, and Mrs. Davis liked to put fruit in the dishes. So, you know, it's the real stuff. If you're a reenactor like these guys, I mean, these guys are all over us because they're studying everything from how did the buttons get sewn on the uniforms to, is this canteen okay, or are they going to call me a fake? You know, because they can come down and look at the 85 canteens that we've got. Yes, sir. One more question. Okay, and then I'll stick around. As Barbara knows, I can't shut up. I'll stick around when, you know, most of you leave. If somebody has a question you'd like to ask me, please come forward. Yes, sir.
You stated earlier that you consider Lincoln making his worst decisions in his first 100 days, and more specifically Fort Sumter. Elaborate on that if you could, please.
It was very interesting. It's a fabulous new book that Bill Cooper wrote. The title of it is Now We Have a War Upon Us, and it's principally about Lincoln between the election and Fort Sumter. You have hotheads in the South, fire eaters. When South Carolina voted to secede from the Union, one of the people who voted against it walked outside and said, South Carolina is too small to be a republic and too large to be a lunatic asylum. Okay. But the lunatics had taken control of the Deep South. The moderate Southerners, who tended to be Democrats, didn't want that to happen. The Upper South did not want that to happen. The moderate Republicans did not want that to happen. The Northern Democrats did not want that to happen. Hardline Republicans was, you know, let them go. William Seward had anticipated being the Republican choice for president. I don't know if you know, in the convention, Lincoln finished 4th in the first ballot. Seward became his closest confidant and Secretary of State. Seward has back-channel conversations with 2 of his friends from the Senate, Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, who became president, vice president of the Confederacy. So there's a lot of discussion going on in January and February, before Lincoln's inaugurated, the first week in March, saying you can appease them a little bit. You can, first of all, do not lose the Upper South, Abe. Do not lose the Upper, they haven't seceded yet. They're not crazy. We can talk to them. Let the Deep South go for now. They'll come back. Let's just, everybody cool their jets. Let's talk this through. Okay. Lincoln's brand new. I mean, you know, he's a little country lawyer from downstate Illinois. He'd served 2 years in the Congress without distinction. He lost his earlier race to Douglas for the Senate. And he's listening to the waves of politics going on, and he keeps listening to the radical Republicans who were saying, you can't let them do that. You've got to declare it a rebellion, not a secession. Now, Lincoln's a smart guy. If it happened today, you got one guy sitting in the White House. Would he consult with Congress? Perhaps. Did Lincoln consult with Congress? No, because Congress would have told him secession's legal. Let them go. Did he consult with the Supreme Court? No, because the Supreme Court would have told him secession is legal. Let them go. Did he consult with the guy who was still the President of the United States? No. Why? He would have told him secession is legal. Let them go. And Lincoln said, I'm going to dig a hole with my radicals, and we're going to decide unilaterally, without consultation of anybody, that it's a rebellion that needs to be put down at the point of a bayonet. And if the Upper South, which is a third of the population of the country, disagrees, to hell with them. And that's what he did. That's what he did. If you want to lay 750 graves at the foot of anybody's monument, put them there at the Lincoln Monument. Okay? Now, so that's pretty rough on Lincoln. Okay? That's a very legitimate view of Lincoln. Lincoln's last 100 days. The four most important words ever spoken by an American president were his instructions on April the 1st at City Point to Grant, Sherman, and Horace Porter. As he said, let them up easy. Lincoln came to understand that he would, once he got reelected, he was going to win the war. That wasn't a question. It's a question of how much time, how many casualties between now and then, but the question became, how can I put this divided country back together again? Look at world history. Look at wars like this. How do they end? The victors take the losers to the guillotine, or drag them like a dog through the streets of Libya like they did Gaddafi, or hang them upside down like Mussolini or something. How did this one end? At Lincoln's instructions, the Southern men were told, go home. And they did. And there was a sense of honor then, that if you gave your word to go home and not fight anymore, you were going to go home and not fight anymore. And people would come to Robert E. Lee and say, you know, the Yankees did this and the Yankees did that. And Lincoln says, no, we've got a country to put back together again. Go home. Become a citizen of the U.S. We're all Americans again. And so our Civil War ended differently than any other in world history, and I put that right at Lincoln's feet too, because he was the one who saw through that. Phil Sheridan, on the other hand, for instance, famous Union general, did not want to let the Confederates surrender in North Carolina. Fought vigorously, do not accept their surrender, we can kill more of them. He's the same guy who said, only good Indian's a dead Indian, and started the war on the Indians, you know. Okay, Barbara, I've had a lot of fun being with you, and I'm staying.
I will refrain from making any kind of an editorial comment. I think we all have a lot to take home. I suggest that you fill up your gas tanks, head south with one of the, or two or three of the 80,000 books, and see if you can find the history as opposed to the politics of the Civil War. Waite, thank you very, very much.